The mail-order bride thought no one wanted her until a little girl whispered, "Can you be my mommy?" Bitterroot Valley Train Depot, Montana Territory, late autumn, 1889. The train shrieked as it slowed, a billow of smoke curling up into gray Montana sky. When the whistle faded, silence settled over the Bitterroot Depot, broken only by the soft crunch of boots on frost-hardened earth and the distant cry of a hawk circling above the valley. Clara Ellsworth stepped down from the car, her gloved hand gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles whitened. She paused on the platform, blinking against the sting of dust and cold air. Her traveling dress, a simple blue wool gown that had seen better days, was wrinkled from the long journey. In her other hand, she carried a carpet bag, its seams frayed and handle loose, containing all that was left of her life in Boston. The depot wasn't much, a squat wooden building with peeling white paint and a hand-painted sign that read Bitterroot. A handful of townsfolk waited nearby, most of the men in wide-brimmed hats and rough coats, looking on with quiet curiosity. A mail-order bride arriving was something of a spectacle in these parts. Clara lifted her chin, trying not to shrink beneath their stares. She'd answered Eli Cartwright's advertisement after months of lonely uncertainty. His letter had been plain but sincere. "I seek a wife to help raise my daughter and tend to a small ranch. I offer hard work, an honest life, and a good home. I am not a man of many words, but I am steady and kind." Those words had been enough to stir something in her heart. She had dreamed of open skies, of purpose, of belonging somewhere again. But now, standing in this foreign land, surrounded by strangers, fear crept through her. The station master, a balding man with tobacco stains on his vest, ambled over. "You the lady from back east?" "Name's Mr. Dugan," he said. "Yes," Clara replied softly. "Clara Ellsworth. I'm to be met by Mr. Eli Cartwright." He frowned, glancing toward the empty road stretching into the distance. "Cartwright, huh? Don't recall seeing him in town today. You sure he knows you're coming?" Her heart gave a nervous flutter. "He wrote that he would be here," she said, though her voice faltered on the last word. Mr. Dugan scratched his beard. "Well, he ain't here now. You can wait inside if you like. Wind'll cut through you before long." Clara followed him into the small waiting room, its walls lined with old timetables and freight notices. She sat on a bench and folded her hands in her lap, trying not to show the growing tremor in her fingers. Hours passed. The depot emptied as the stagecoach took the last of the passengers toward town. The shadows grew long. Outside, the sun dipped behind the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the valley in bands of gold and purple. Still no one came. Mr. Dugan returned once more, hat in hand. "Ma'am," he said gently, "there's a boarding house across from the Mercantile. Miss Henderson runs it. You can stay the night, and we'll telegraph Mr. Cartwright come morning." Clara nodded numbly and rose. The boards creaked beneath her feet as she stepped outside again. Her breath misted in the cooling air. She was halfway across the road when a small, trembling voice stopped her. "Excuse me, ma'am." Clara turned. Standing beside a hitching post was a little girl no older than 6. Her blonde curls peeked out beneath a wool bonnet too big for her head. Her coat was patched at the elbows, her boots caked in mud. But her eyes, sky blue and searching, were what caught Clara's breath. "Yes, sweetheart." Clara asked softly, crouching to her level. The child hesitated, clutching a ragged doll against her chest. Her lip quivered. "Are you the lady who was supposed to marry my papa?" Clara blinked in surprise. "Your papa?" The girl nodded. "Eli Cartwright. That's my daddy's name." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. Clara looked down the road again, still empty, then she turned back to the child. "Yes," she whispered. "I came to meet him." The little girl's expression softened with relief. She stepped closer, voice trembling. "Then can you be my mommy?" Clara froze, the words hitting her like a gentle but undeniable blow. Her eyes filled with tears she hadn't expected. She reached out instinctively, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. "Oh, darling," she murmured, her throat tightening. "Why would you ask me that?" The girl looked down at her doll. "'Cause I prayed for one," she said simply. Papa says Mama's in heaven, but I don't think she'll mind if I borrow another one for a while. Clara felt something within her break and heal all at once. Before she could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed on the wooden planks. A man emerged from the shadow of the station, tall, broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low. His coat was worn, his expression unreadable. "Annie," he said, his voice deep and rough, "you shouldn't have run off." The girl turned. "Papa, she's here, the lady from the letter." His gaze shifted to Clara. For a long, breathless moment, neither spoke. He removed his hat, eyes filled with quiet turmoil. "You came," he finally said. Clara managed a small nod. "Yes, Mr. Cartwright, I came." The wind tugged at her skirt, and the last train whistle sounded in the distance, a haunting farewell. Eli's face tightened, grief flickering across it. "You shouldn't have," he murmured. "The letter was a mistake." And with that, he turned to lead his daughter away, leaving Clara standing alone on the cold wooden platform, her dreams unraveling like the smoke drifting into the darkening sky. But somewhere deep inside her heart, a child's simple question echoed, "Can you be my mommy?" And Clara knew her journey in Bitterroot was far from over. The Cartwright homestead, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. Later that same evening, the ride to the Cartwright ranch was silent, except for the creak of leather and the distant howl of coyotes. Clara sat stiffly in the wagon beside Eli Cartwright, her gloved hands clasped around her carpet bag, the small lantern swinging between them through flickering shadows over his face, hard, chiseled, and weary. In the back, little Annie hummed softly to her doll, unaware of the storm brewing in the space between her father and their unexpected guest. Eli's jaw worked as he guided the reins. "You shouldn't have come," he said finally, his tone low, as though speaking to the night itself. Clara stared ahead, her voice trembling but steady. "You wrote me, Mr. Cartwright." I answered. "I came as agreed." He didn't look at her. "I wrote that letter months ago, after my wife passed. I wasn't in my right mind. I didn't mean to bring someone else into this." The words hit her like a slap, but she kept her composure. "I see," she whispered. They reached the ranch just as the moon broke through the clouds, a wide spread nestled between dark pines and the Bitterroot River. The main house, though large, carried an air of abandonment. The windows were dark, the porch rails splintered, and the barn sagged slightly under the weight of time and neglect. As Eli climbed down, Annie leapt from the wagon and ran ahead. "Papa, can she stay in Mama's room?" she called, her voice bright and innocent. Eli froze. "No," he said quickly. "She'll stay in the guest room." Then to Clara, without meeting her eyes, "You can stay the night. Tomorrow, I'll take you to town and pay for your fare back east." Clara's throat tightened. "I don't need charity, Mr. Cartwright," she said softly, "but I'd be grateful for a roof over my head, just until I can find work." He hesitated, the conflict in his eyes plain even under the dim lantern light. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Suit yourself." Inside, the house told the story of loss. A faded quilt still lay across the back of the settee, a child's drawing pinned crookedly on the wall, and a woman's shawl hung by the door untouched. Clara's gaze lingered on a framed sketch near the mantel, a smiling woman holding a younger Annie. "That's my mama," the little girl said proudly. Her name was Martha. She used to sing when she cooked. "Do you sing, Miss Clara?" Clara's voice softened. "Sometimes. Not very well." Annie giggled. "That's okay. Papa says Mama couldn't either." Eli busied himself at the stove, heating water for tea, his movements stiff. "Annie, it's bedtime." The child pouted. "But I want to talk to Miss Clara." "Bed. Now." His tone was firm, the authority of a man who'd lost too much to risk losing more. Annie sighed but obeyed, hugging Clara's waist before scampering off. "Good night, Miss Clara. I'm glad you came." The words warmed Clara more than the fire could. When the girl's footsteps faded upstairs, Eli poured 2 tin cups of tea and handed one to Clara. "You've come a long way," he said after a pause. "And I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. I shouldn't have written that ad." Clara's eyes glistened in the firelight. "Perhaps you needed someone to write to," she said gently. "Grief has strange ways of asking for company." He looked up sharply, caught off guard by her calm understanding. "I don't mean to intrude," she continued, "but I have nowhere to return to, Mr. Cartwright. My father passed, and there's no one waiting for me back east. If you allow it, I could help here, cook, clean, care for Annie, just until spring." Eli studied her, his gaze heavy with unspoken questions. "I can't promise you anything, Miss Ellsworth. I'm not asking for promises," she said quietly. "Only a chance to earn my keep." A long silence passed. The fire crackled, filling the space between them. Finally, Eli gave a slow nod. "All right," he said. "You can stay. But understand this. I'm not looking for a wife." Clara met his eyes. "And I'm not looking to be someone's ghost." The faintest flicker of respect passed over his face. Later that night, as the household slept, Clara sat by the small window of the guest room, writing in her journal by candlelight. November 12th, 1889. I have arrived at the end of the world, among mountains and memories that are not my own. He does not want me here, and yet his daughter's eyes hold something that feels like home. Perhaps God led me here not to find love, but to mend what grief has broken. Outside, a cold wind swept across the valley, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. Clara blew out the candle and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Down the hall, she heard the faint murmur of Eli's voice through the thin walls, the quiet, aching tone of a man speaking to someone who was no longer there. He whispered, "Martha, I don't know what to do." Clara closed her eyes and prayed silently. "Neither do I." The Cartwright Ranch, Bitterroot Valley, late November to early December, 1889. The first week passed in a quiet rhythm, one that felt both fragile and unspoken. Clara Ellsworth rose before dawn, lighting the kitchen stove and boiling water before Eli Cartwright and his daughter stirred. She moved through the house like a guest in someone else's dream, careful not to touch what wasn't hers, careful not to disturb the lingering echoes of the woman who had once filled his home. Everywhere she turned, Martha Cartwright's presence lingered. A half-finished embroidery hoop on the parlor table, a pair of delicate gloves tucked behind the door, the faint scent of lavender soap on the linens. It wasn't that Eli kept these things out of sentiment. He simply couldn't bear to touch them. They remained as they were, as though the house itself refused to let her go. Clara noticed how the man avoided certain rooms. The bedroom in the hall, the small music box on the mantel, the family Bible left closed since the funeral. He rarely spoke at the table, his words measured, his gaze distant. But Annie, bright as springtime, filled the silences her father couldn't. Each morning, she'd sit beside Clara at the kitchen table while she kneaded bread dough, her small hands dusted with flour. "Do you know how to make honey biscuits?" Annie asked one morning, swinging her legs. Clara smiled softly. "I might." "Why?" "'Cause Mama used to make them on Sundays. Papa says I'm too little to try." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and leaned down conspiratorially. "Well, maybe we'll surprise him this Sunday, but you'll have to keep the secret." Annie's eyes lit up. "Cross my heart." Their laughter filled the kitchen, a sound that hadn't graced that house in months. From the barn window, Eli paused from mending a saddle, his hammer still in hand, and listened. He didn't smile, but the sound lingered with him long after he returned to work. That night, Clara sat by the fireplace, mending one of Eli's shirts. The silence stretched between them like a long shadow. She wanted to say something, anything, but fear breaking the fragile peace they'd found. Instead, it was Eli who finally spoke. "Annie's been sleeping better lately," he said without looking up from his book. Clara's needle paused mid-stitch. "Children find comfort in small things. A bit of warmth, a story, a steady hand." He nodded, thoughtful. "She's taken to you quick." Clara hesitated. Children see kindness before they see anything else. He closed his book, his gaze drifting to the fire. "You remind me of someone who still believes in good things." Her eyes softened. "You don't." Eli's voice dropped low. "Not for a long while." A few days later, Clara took Annie into town to buy sugar and fabric from a mercantile. The gossip reached her before she even crossed the threshold. Two women near the barrels of coffee whispered loud enough for her to hear. She came all the way from Boston. They say, a mail-order bride who wasn't wanted. Cartwright took her, and anyway, some women don't know when to quit chasing what ain't theirs. Clara stood frozen for a moment, the color draining from her face. Annie tugged her hand. What's wrong, Miss Clara? She forced a smile. Nothing, sweetheart. Let's get what we came for. But the words lingered long after they returned home. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Clara found Eli in the barn. He was brushing down his horse, the rhythmic motion slow and steady. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then said quietly, the people in town don't seem to take kindly to strangers. He didn't turn. They'll talk until they find something else to whisper about. But it isn't right, she said. They think that you're here to replace Martha, he finished, his tone sharp. He turned to her then, eyes tired but steady. You can't blame them. Folks don't understand grief unless they've been trapped in it. Clara swallowed hard. And you, Mr. Cartwright, do you understand it? Eli looked down, his hands tightening on the brush. Every day. The barn fell silent except for the sound of the horse breathing. Clara stepped forward slowly. I'm not here to take her place, she said softly. I couldn't if I tried. But I can help Annie remember the good things. Not the loss, but the love. For the first time since she'd arrived, Eli met her eyes. There was something raw and uncertain in his gaze. Not affection, not yet, but the faint spark of trust. He gave a slow nod. That'd mean a lot. Weeks passed. Snow began to fall, soft and steady, blanketing the valley in white. The house grew warmer, cozier, alive again. Clara taught Annie to read by the firelight. They made biscuits on Sundays, just as promised. Eli began joining them at the table more often, sometimes even telling a story or two about the early days of the ranch. But the ghosts of the past still lingered in quiet corners. One night, Clara found Eli standing at the back door, staring out into the falling snow. She'd have liked you, he said suddenly. Clara turned to him, startled. Martha, he said, voice rough. She always said the Lord sends people for reasons we don't understand. Maybe she'd say you were one of them. Clara's throat tightened. Maybe we're both here for reasons we don't yet see. He gave her a small nod before stepping away into cold, his figure fading into the snow. And though she didn't know it yet, that night marked the first crack in the walls he'd built around his heart. The Cartwright homestead, deep winter, January 1890. The Bitterroot Valley lay frozen beneath a sky of steel-gray clouds. The river ran slow and silent, sheathed in ice, and the pines bent beneath the weight of snow. Inside the Cartwright homestead, warmth flickered from the hearth, a small refuge against the biting cold. Clara Ellsworth had come to think of that fire as the heart of the house, a place of light and laughter since she and Annie began baking by its glow, or reading aloud from the Bible in the evenings while Eli listened quietly from his chair. But that winter, the wind was cruel, it was scarce, and cattle were starving on the far pastures. Eli rose before dawn each day, driving his horse through knee-deep snow to break ice for the herd. Clara begged him to take a hired hand from town, but he only shook his head. Don't got the money for that, he said. If I don't do it myself, we'll lose the whole lot. She watched him ride out each morning, his figure disappearing into the pale blue mist. A quiet dread grew in her chest, one she couldn't quite name. One evening, as the wind howled and sleet lashed against the windows, Eli hadn't returned by nightfall. Annie sat curled in a blanket, her little face pale with worry. Do you think Papa's cold? She asked. Clara smiled faintly. Your father's tougher than the winter, sweetheart, but we'll keep the fire going bright for him. The flames roared and crackled as the hours passed. Clara added another log, but the smoke curled oddly up the flue. She frowned, noticing the chimney draft wasn't drawing properly, but dismissed it, thinking it the fault of the storm outside. An hour later, she smelled it, a sharp, bitter scent that sliced through the air like a warning. Annie, she said quickly, standing, go put on your boots and coat, dear. Why? Clara's eyes darted upward. Faint wisps of smoke trailed down from the ceiling seam. Now, Annie, hurry. The child obeyed, frightened by the tremor in Clara's voice. Clara ran to the hearth. Flames were licking at the back bricks, sparks leaping where the soot had caught. Panic surged in her chest. She grabbed a kettle of water, threw it onto the fire. It hissed, but the heat only deepened. Then came the unmistakable sound. Crack! The flue, giving way inside the wall. Smoke poured into the room. Clara snatched Annie into her arms and pressed a wet cloth over the girl's face. "Hold on tight to me, darling," she coughed, her eyes stinging. "We're getting out." The front door refused to budge, warped by the heat. Flames licked along the drapes, then the rug. Clara's heart thundered. The kitchen window. It was their only way. She wrapped Annie in a blanket and smashed the glass with the poker, ignoring the pain as shards cut her hand. "Go, sweetheart," she urged, pushing Annie through first. "Crawl and don't look back." The girl screamed, "Miss Clara, come on." The smoke thickened, swallowing the world in choking darkness. Clara coughed violently, her lungs burning. She stumbled toward the window, but her skirt caught on a nail. For one harrowing second, she thought she wouldn't make it. Then rough, strong arms yanked her free. Through the haze, she heard Eli's voice shouting, "Clara, I've got you." He pulled her and Annie both through the window and into the snow, where they collapsed in a heap. Behind them, the house crackled and hissed, flames devouring the roof in a roar of orange light. Eli held Annie close. Trembling, his eyes met Clara's, her face streaked with soot, her hair singed, blood on her hands from the broken glass. You went back in there?" he stammered, voice breaking. She was inside. Clara gasped. "I wasn't about to leave your little girl." Eli's expression twisted with disbelief and something deeper, gratitude so fierce it hurt. He looked at the fire again, the house that had been his life with Martha, now reduced to glowing embers. When the roof collapsed, he didn't flinch, only pulled Clara and Annie against him as snow began to fall again, the flakes glowing orange in the firelight. By morning, the house was gone, nothing left but a blackened frame and the smell of ash. They took shelter in the barn, huddled beneath blankets. The horses shifted restlessly nearby, their breath misting in the cold air. Eli sat beside Clara as she rested, her bandaged hands trembling slightly. Annie slept between them, her small body curled like a kitten. Eli spoke quietly, voice raw. "That house was all I had left of Martha." Clara turned her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, it wasn't." He looked at her, confused. "She lives in Annie, in the love you give her, in the man who still rides out every morning to keep this family alive." He swallowed hard, unable to speak. After a long moment, he said, "You saved her, Clara. You saved my little girl. I don't know how to repay that." Clara's eyes softened. "You already have." Outside, dawn broke over the valley, pale gold spilling across the snow. The house was gone, but in its place stood something new, something unspoken. It wasn't love yet, not quite, but it was forgiveness. And forgiveness, as Clara would soon learn, was where love began. Bitterroot Valley in the town of Willow Bend, late January, 1890. The Cartwright homestead stood in ruins, its ashes smothered under a thick quilt of snow. The smell of smoke still clung to the air, and for days afterward, Eli Cartwright, Clara Ellsworth, and little Annie made their home in the barn. The storm had passed, but the nights were cruel, when the wind howled through the broken boards. Clara would wrap Annie in every blanket they had, holding her close until the child drifted to sleep. Eli always took the coldest corner, refusing the comfort of the quilts Clara offered. "You'll freeze out here," she said one night, voice trembling as the wind rattled the tin roof. He shook his head. "I've had colder nights. You and Annie need the warmth more." But when she reached over and laid her hand on his callous, cold but steady, he didn't pull away. When word reached town about the fire, the story twisted faster than prairie wind. By the time Eli hitched the wagon to fetch supplies, whispers had turned to accusation. "She burned it down herself," murmured Mrs. Hodge, the grocer's wife, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Convenient, ain't it? Move in with the widower, then burn the old wife's memory to the ground." "Wouldn't put it past her," another woman agreed. "City girls always got something up their sleeve." Eli stood in the mercantile doorway, the weight of their words heavy as a hammer. He didn't speak, not yet, but the muscle in his jaw twitched. When Clara entered a few minutes later, her eyes widened at the hush that fell over the room. She carried her basket close, her cheeks flushed from the cold and embarrassment. "Morning, Mr. Dugan," she said softly to the shopkeeper. "I need flour, sugar, and soap, please." Dugan nodded curtly, his usual warmth replaced with awkward reserve. "Sure thing, Miss Ellsworth." The women at the back snickered. Clara felt their stares prick like needles against her back. She gathered her things, paid with the little money she had left, and left the store without a word. Outside, she stood by the wagon, blinking back tears. Eli appeared moments later, his face dark with fury. "Did you hear them?" she asked quietly, not looking up. "I heard enough," he said. "And if they weren't women, I'd have taught a few of them manners." Clara gave a shaky laugh that wasn't laughter at all. "Let them think what they will. I've learned you can't fight whispers. They find you wherever you go." Eli's hand flexed at his side, as though wanting to reach for her but not daring. "You shouldn't have to bear it. None of this is your fault." She turned toward him, her eyes glistening. "Then why does it feel like it is?" He had no answer. Back at the ranch, Clara threw herself into work. She cleaned the barn, mended clothes, and cooked over a campfire when weather allowed. She refused to let pity take root. But one evening, as she scrubbed a pot by lantern light, exhaustion overtook her. The tears she'd held back for weeks spilled freely now. "I should go," she whispered to herself. "They'll never accept me here." "And he—" She stopped, glancing toward the stall where Eli was bedding the horses. "He doesn't need me any more." She wiped her face quickly when she saw Annie approach, clutching her ragged doll. "Miss Clara," Annie said sleepily, "why are you crying?" Clara knelt, forcing a small smile. "I'm just tired, darling. That's all." The little girl frowned. "You're sad 'cause of the mean ladies, ain't you? Papa says folks talk when they don't understand something." Clara's heart ached. "He said that." Annie nodded solemnly. "He said Mama used to cry when people talked about her, too. But he told her, you don't answer gossip with words. You answer with the truth you live." Clara hugged the child tightly, unable to speak. The next morning, Clara packed her things, the worn carpetbag that had brought her to Bitterroot, and folded a note for Eli. "Mr. Cartwright, thank you for your kindness and for allowing me to stay. Annie is a blessing. She'll grow into a fine young lady with your strength and her mother's grace. Please tell her I'll write once I've found work in town. See Ellsworth." She set on the table and turned to leave, but before she could step out, the door swung open. Eli stood there, snow melting from his hat, breath coming in white clouds. His eyes fell on the bag in her hand, then the note. "You were planning to leave?" Clara straightened, trying to keep her composure. "It's what's best. The gossip will fade once I'm gone." His jaw tightened. "You think I care what they say?" "They're saying about me," she replied, her voice breaking. "And you can't afford more talk, Eli. You've lost enough." He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the straw-strewn floor. "You think you're a burden, but you ain't. You're the only reason Annie laughs anymore. The only reason I can walk through what's left of that house without Fallon part." Clara's breath caught. "Please don't say that." "I have to," he said, voice rough, "'cause I've been too much of a coward not to." Silence filled the barn, thick and trembling. Outside, snow drifted down in lazy spirals. Eli took another step closer, his voice low and earnest. "You came here a stranger, Clara. You saved my little girl, and you gave me back something I thought was gone forever. You can walk away if you want, but don't think for a second you ain't wanted here." Clara's hand trembled on the handle of her bag. For a long moment, she couldn't meet his gaze. Then, slowly, she let the bag fall to the floor. Annie, woken by their voices, appeared at the top of the loft stairs. "Miss Clara, are you go away?" Clara turned toward her, tears shining in her eyes. "I was sweetheart." Annie ran down the steps, her small arms wrapping tight around Clara's waist. "Don't go. Daddy won't say it, but he needs you. I need you." Eli stood still, every muscle taut, watching the scene unfold. The woman he'd tried not to care for, the daughter he'd nearly lost, both clinging to one another in the glow of the lantern light. He took a deep breath. "Clara," he said finally, voice thick with emotion, "please stay." That night, after Annie had fallen asleep, Eli sat with Clara near the dying fire. The silence was soft now, no longer the kind that hurt. He stared into flames, then spoke quietly. "I was wrong to push you away. I thought keeping my distance was protecting what was left of me, but all it did was keep me lonely." Clara's eyes shimmered in the firelight. "I didn't come here to replace anyone, Eli. I came because I thought I had no home. But maybe God sent me to help you find yours again." He turned to her, his hand brushing hers lightly. "Maybe he sent you to help me believe again." Outside, the wind softened to a whisper, and the first light of dawn began to creep over the mountains. The promise of something new. Bitterroot Valley, Montana, early spring, 1890. By March, the heavy snows began to melt, and the valley softened under the kiss of spring. The land, once gray and lifeless, breathed again, with wildflowers pressing to thawing earth, and the river breaking free of its icy chains. For the first time since the fire, the Cartwright Ranch began to stir with life. Eli rose before dawn, mending fences and rebuilding walls. His hands, once roughened by loss, found renewed purpose in shaping wood, nailing beams, and carving the future he thought he'd buried with his wife. And beside him, always, was Clara Ellsworth. She worked like she'd been born to land, her city hands learning the rhythm of country life. Milking before sunrise, sewing curtains from feed sacks, and teaching Annie how to read by the light of the lantern. Eli often caught himself watching her when she didn't notice, her hair slipping loose as she stirred the morning porridge, her quiet laughter when Annie said something clever, the way she'd hum hymns while hanging wash under the spring sun. Once, when he saw her standing in the field at dusk, hair gilded by fading light, the mountains painted gold behind her, he thought, so this is what grace looks like. The barn had become their home in all but name. Eli had repaired the loft and built a small hearth against the wall. Smoke curled gently from its chimney, a signal of survival. Clara, ever practical, had refused to move into the new cabin Eli was building until it was fully done. "A lady ought to earn her roof," she said, half teasing. Eli smiled at that, though the truth was he'd have built her a castle if he could. One afternoon, as the sky threatened rain, Eli found Clara kneeling by a row of freshly turned soil near the barn. Annie sat beside her, holding a small tin pail of seeds. "What are you two up to?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag. Annie grinned. "We're making a garden, Papa. Miss Clara says if we plant now, we'll have peas and carrots come summer." Clara looked up, her cheeks flushed. "I figured the land could use a little tending, and so could we." Eli crouched beside them, studying the neat rows. "Looks good," he said. "You've got a knack for this." She smiled softly. "I had to learn. Back in St. Louis, I grew flowers in pots by the window. They never lasted long, but I loved watching them reach for the light." He paused, studying her face, the way she said reach for the light as though she'd done the same all her life. "Seems you brought that gift here," he said finally. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken, tender, uncertain, but deeply real. Later that evening, a spring storm rolled through. Rain drummed against the roof while thunder echoed in the valley. Annie slept soundly upstairs, but Clara stood by the fire, staring at the flames. Eli entered quietly, his shirt damp from checking the animals. "They're all safe," he said, brushing water from his hat. "Good," she murmured. "I worry about them, silly as it sounds." He chuckled softly. "Ain't silly at all. You got a good heart." She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if it's too soft. Life's not kind to gentle souls." Eli stepped closer, the flicker of firelight catching the lines of his face. Warm but kind. Maybe not, but gentle souls are what make life worth living. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm outside faded to a low rumble. Then Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved bird, whittled from pine. "Been mayonine to give you this," he said quietly. Annie says it looks like the ones that nest near the river. Figured you'd like it. Clara took it gently, her fingers brushing his. The carving was simple but beautiful, wings outstretched, as if frozen mid-flight. Eli, she whispered, it's lovely. I ain't good with words, he said, meeting her gaze. But I wanted you to know, you brought something back here, not just to the ranch, to us. Her breath caught, emotion trembling in her voice. You've given me more than you realize, Eli. A home, a purpose, a family. Outside, the last thunder rolled away, leaving the sound of dripping eaves and the quiet sigh of the wind. Eli took her hand, slow, reverent, and didn't let go. The next morning, the world looked new. The valley shimmered with dew, and the air smelled of rain and earth. Annie ran barefoot to the wet grass, laughter ringing like bells. Clara stood in the doorway, watching her, a soft smile on her lips. Eli joined her, leaning on the doorframe. She's got your spirit, he said. Clara laughed lightly. I think she's got her father's stubbornness. He grinned, the first real smile she'd seen from him in months. Maybe so. And for the first time, she felt like this quiet, ordinary morning, was what she had been waiting for all along. That night, as the stars shimmered over the valley, Clara wrote in her small journal, the one she'd carried since she left St. Louis. I thought I was unwanted. But sometimes, it's not the world that must open its arms. It's the heart that must open first. I see now that love isn't given. It's grown, like spring from the frozen earth. She closed the book and looked toward the horizon, where the mountains stood tall and patient, like sentinels watching over their fragile, blooming hope. Bitterroot Valley, Montana, late summer, 1890. By late August, the Bitterroot Valley was alive with color. Golden fields of wheat bowed under the sun, the air thick with the scent of pine and wild sage. The mountains, once distant and cold, now looked like gentle giants watching over their little homestead. The Cartwright Ranch, rebuilt from ashes, stood proud again. A new house, smaller than the old one but stronger, rose against the hill. Eli had built it himself, board by board, with Clara's careful hands beside his own. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. The barn, once their only shelter, was now filled with laughter, chickens, and the smell of hay. Annie had taken to naming every calf and chick, and Clara swore the girl could talk to animals better than she could to people. Yet for all the joy, a quiet unease lingered. Whispers from town hadn't fully died. Some still said the mail-order bride came to trap a widower. Others whispered Eli had taken pity on a woman no one else would want. And when the pastor rode out from Willow Bend one Sunday, his tone was polite but cool. I trust you understand the talk, Mr. Cartwright, he said, glancing toward Clara. Some folks think it improper. A woman and man living under one roof without the good Lord's blessing. Eli's jaw set. Ain't much the town's business what happens under my roof, Reverend. But Clara stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. Pastor, I came here to make a life, not scandal. I'll not bring shame to Eli or his child, but I will not be chased away again either. The pastor studied her, then nodded once. Then maybe it's time you two make things right before God and man alike. That night, Eli sat on the porch, whittling in silence while the crickets sang. Clara joined him with 2 cups of coffee. The moonlight silvered her hair, and the sound of Annie's laughter drifted from inside. I spoke with the Reverend. Eli said after a long pause. He says the folks stop talking once we marry. Clara's fingers tightened around her cup. You don't owe me that, Eli. He looked up sharply. I ain't do it out of debt. Then why? She whispered. He set his knife down and leaned forward, eyes steady and soft. Because somewhere between the fire and the frost, between you teaching Annie her letters and saving me from my own grief, I stopped calling this place mine. It became ours. Clara's breath caught. Eli, he stood, taking her hand in his rough, warm palm. I ain't good with fancy words, but I know this. You were sent here for us, not just to rebuild a house, but a home. You gave me back my faith, and you gave Annie her mother again. Tears blurred her vision. And what of you, Eli? What did I give you? He smiled, that quiet, humble smile that reached his eyes. You gave me the reason to live again. A week later, the town gathered at the small white chapel. It wasn't fancy, just weathered wood, and wildflowers picked from the valley. But when Clara walked down that short aisle, wearing a simple blue dress and holding Annie's hand instead of bouquet, even the gossiping tongues stilled. Annie beamed between them, her curls bouncing as she whispered, "Now I have a mama and a papa." The Reverend's voice was solemn but kind. "Do you, Eli Cartwright, take Clara Ellsworth to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love, honor, and cherish her all your days?" "I do," Eli said, steady as a promise. "And do you, Miss Ellsworth, take this man and his daughter as your family, to stand beside them in hardship and in grace?" Clara's eyes glistened. "I do, with all my heart." When Eli kissed her, the wind swept through the open door, a warm, soft gust carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, like the valley itself was blessing their union. After the ceremony, the small crowd dispersed, leaving just the three of them standing beneath the cottonwood tree outside the chapel. The golden light of evening wrapped around them. Annie tugged at Clara's hand. "Mama, can we go home now?" Clara smiled, kneeling to meet her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. Home." Eli bent down beside them, his arm around Clara's shoulders. "We'll go home," he said softly. "And this time, we won't ever start over again. We'll just keep building." That night, back at the ranch, the new house glowed with lamplight. The garden Clara planted in spring now bloomed wild and full. Sunflowers, peas, and roses tangled together in defiance of all that had tried to break them. Eli and Clara stood on the porch as the stars came out. Annie had already fallen asleep inside, her ragged doll tucked under her arm. "Seems the valley's finally quiet," Clara said with a gentle smile. Eli nodded. "Ain't the valley. It's us. We finally found peace." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I thought no one wanted me, Eli. Not after all I lost." He turned to her, voice barely above a whisper. "I reckon God just needed to lead you where you were wanted most." And for a long time, they stood together under the wide Montana sky, no longer a lonely widower and forgotten bride, but a family born not of chance, but of grace. In the heart of the Bitterroot Valley, a man who'd lost everything and a woman who thought herself unwanted learned that love isn't found in grand gestures or promises, but in the quiet rebuilding of broken things. And from ashes and whispers, they grew something eternal, a home,